Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road. On this episode, we are joined by Michael Jahosky to discuss his recent book, The Good News of the Return of the King. I want to start by giving a shout out to our patrons and especially our executive producers, Caitlin of Tea with Tolkien, Lise Yu, Andrew T, John R, and Ms. Anonymous. Thank you all so much. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I have to say, I want to make sure that I said your last name correctly because as I was
You
saying it, I was like, wait a minute, am I saying his name correctly?
you nailed it. I've had some interesting pronunciations over the last few months. That was perfect.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I know we've spoken before
Yes.
too, but it's been a little while, um and I wanted, and it's always doing a podcast on Tolkien has perpetually put me in fear of pronouncing things incorrectly
Mm,
because it's like there's just landmines of that nature everywhere. And
everywhere.
here you are trying to do a podcast on Tolkien, and it's like, you know, suddenly you become sensitive, very sensitive to getting things correctly. A, because he had
Mm,
so many interesting and unique words,
hmm.
and B, because he was a linguist himself. So you're like, to do justice to this, I gotta have my act together on stuff. So
A
anyway,
little intimidating. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. So Michael is an assistant professor of humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida. He routinely incorporates the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien into his humanities classes curriculums, and this is his first book. So,
Hmm.
Michael, tell us about the history of your own Tolkien fandom.
Oh, yeah. So I tell it in the preface of my book. The short story is that at 16, right before Peter Jackson's, although I was just in an interview recently, there was a hiccup where the interviewer said Samuel Jackson. I was cracking up. Um,
A little bit different there, yeah.
yeah, a little bit different. Yeah. Peter Jackson's first film, I think, was December 2001. And my brother Chris, who's 4 years my senior, started reading The Fellowship to me and was like, oh, okay, we'll listen to this. I've not really heard of Tolkien before. And I said, well, there's a movie coming out and I like movies. And so he started reading them to me. We went and watched the movie. We stood in line outside in the blistering Florida weather, that's always so crisp here. And we watched the movie, and I started annoying him with tons of questions. And I remember still bugging him, I think the next year, where I still had questions about Gandalf, and he was just like, just watch, and we'll talk about it later. So Chris was a big influence on my love of Tolkien, and then, of course, I started devouring the books. And so I didn't stop at The Lord of the Rings. I went and I read The Hobbit, I think, first. The Silmarillion, I really didn't tackle until many years later in college, probably, which wasn't too far after that.
That's normal.
So, yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very small chunks. And then, of course, when I started researching this book, which really kind of unofficially started in 2012 ish, and then more so in 2014, 2015, I definitely, took a deeper dive. So it was a slow, gradual journey. I tell you in the book that my rediscovery of Christianity too occurred simultaneously alongside my discovery of Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see any significance between those two things happening at the same time in my life. I had been a cradle Catholic. We left the church. My parents got divorced, and then we were kind of nothing. And then my mom rediscovered Christianity, and I'm like, okay, Chris is reading this to me. This is great. My mom is becoming a Christian. I'm going to explore that. And it wasn't until 2011-ish that I saw the connection. So it took over a decade to see that God put those two things happening in my life at the same time for a reason. So that's
Mm-hmm.
that's the short version. Yeah.
Got it. All right. Um, so I can definitely sympathize with the like kind of the religious awakening combined with increasing Tolkien fandom.
Mm.
Uh, I'll just say the parabolic arc of those two
Ah,
things, because
I
that's
see
going
what
to
you
come
did
up
there.
later for us. so,
Uh,
uh, so that's really interesting. I just
mhm.
have to ask, do you have a favorite Tolkien character? I'm kind of springing this on you.
um, I would probably have to say Aragorn, which is
Aragorn.
probably
Yeah.
apparent from the title of my book. Yeah.
Yeah. That
Yep.
would make sense. Definitely. Since you,
Yep.
you kind of wrote a book on him, it's
Yeah.
not
Pretty
exactly
much.
just on him,
No.
but he's
No.
definitely the character that would seem the most in focus. So, yeah.
Hmm. Most certainly. Yep.
All right. So the good news of the Return of the King is me start again. The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle Earth, is billed as
Mm.
a book that endeavors to show the truth, goodness, and beauty of Jesus Christ, the Gospel, and the biblical meta narrative by engaging the imagination through J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, as well as The Hobbit and The Silmarillion. As a work of imaginative fiction similar to Jesus' parables, The Lord of the Rings can bypass both intellectual and imaginative objections to the gospel and pull back the veil of familiarity that obscures the gospel from many. So, Michael, what inspired the writing of this book?
Yeah, my own journey to so two things to kind of make sense of later in 2011 and after why those two things, discovering Tolkien and rediscovering Christianity, occurred at the same time. So it started kind of unofficially as Microsoft Word journaling notes during Advent.
Mhm.
When was off of fall semester, I would be exhausted, and I'd read the books, or had been reading the books in the fall, and would finish reading the books, and I was typing up some things. So it started kind of very pensively and reflectively like that, to try to make sense of this long journey that started probably in 2001, as I said. And then secondly, because I was really frustrated by the inability at first for me to understand how it seems that Tolkien was confused about allegory, when in fact I've learned he wasn't at all.
Hmm.
It's that we are, and that we, be very general, some of us are, and that I wanted to try to understand. Some of the books I were reading were unsatisfying. I'm thinking they almost seem to have an answer on the tip of their tongues about how this is a Christian story, but he makes it seem like it's not. And that somehow still makes it feel very much like a Christian story. Trying
Mhm.
to understand that and make sense of that for others. And so it was those two things. That's really what prompted the writing of the book.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, this is definitely an issue. That's
Mm.
definitely an issue that we have, dealt with in depth on several episodes of this podcast
Oh,
in the past. Going all the way back to the beginning, it was something that was a very interesting sort of like one of the themes that I guess launched this podcast for me. And
oh,
so it's and having read what you say in your book, I'm very intrigued by kind of you take some of this to the next level. And so
mm,
this
yeah.
discussion of what allegory is, what it means that Lord of the Rings is that Tolkien said that it is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, right?
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
so we'll definitely get into some of those things.
I look forward to it. Yeah.
In the preface, you say, "I realize that Lord of the Rings has been my road into Jerusalem." So tell
Mm.
us what this means.
Yeah, so two things on the back cover that you read, the quotation, and I'm not sure if C.S. Lewis got this from someone else or it was his wording, but both the veil of familiarity reference on the back cover of the book and this road into Jerusalem is both quotes are from C.S. Lewis.
Hmm,
The road into Jerusalem is from, I believe, Christianity and Culture essay. I forget which collection it is. HarperCollins kind of repackaged them recently.
okay.
Maybe Christian Reflections, I think, if anybody's interested.
Mhm.
And he talks about how culture, things outside of the church, may be a way, there may be something there that may serve as somebody's reason or prompting precipitation of entering the church. And the road into Jerusalem is basically one's journey to becoming a disciple of Christ. And that's how I'm using the phrase. And so that's kind of what I meant by that. And it was also personally, significant for me because whilst researching and journaling and preparing to write this book, I took two trips, 2014 and 2016, with SPC students where I teach humanities, to Israel, which would be impossible now, knowing what's going on in that part of the world,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is just nuts. But we met some wonderful people, so it seemed to kind of be a very perfect title for the preface.
Mhm.
So that's what I meant by it. My journey, and that the Lord of the Rings was my, I think, journey to Christ, to really understanding what it meant to be a Christian, because I had no idea. I kind of fumbled my way. I think like most people, you kind of figure it out. Sometimes I just had a friend say on Facebook, he wished he had a mentor. I didn't really have a lot of mentors, so it was an uninitiated Christian trying to find his place and trying to find the right church, the right pastor, the right
Sure.
older
Mhm.
folks to try to figure things out. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little sidebar, not too far off the beaten path, but speaking of roads,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I I was supposed to go to the Holy Land in 2001, when it sounds like you were first getting into Lord of the Rings.
Oh, how
Um,
weird.
and it was actually back when I was in the Navy, and they actually had to. We were going to be there in the summer of 2001,
Hmm.
and because we were um, because we were members of the U.S. military, things started getting so hot there in early 2001 that they were like, we can't send you guys. And we were all looking like that would have been like I was going to do all this cool stuff going to the Holy Land, and then being there for like a month or something, and then like going and
Oh,
visiting some other places in Europe, and it all got
that would have been.
canceled. So that was a huge bummer. So I'm
Oh
like,
man, I'm
I
so
feel bad
sorry.
for for your students who have not been able to be back, or maybe don't have that on their radars right now, because
Mm,
that's because things are so hot over there right now.
yeah,
Um,
exactly right.
yeah, and something we should surely all remember to pray for is the peace of that region, for
Oh,
sure.
absolutely. Yes.
Well, I love that term, veil of familiarity.
Mm,
And I'm not surprised it comes from Lewis, because
mhm.
he like Tolkien had such a way with words.
Yes,
Um,
he did.
but I just love this idea that for so many people, um, the gospel likely has a veil of familiarity over it, meaning that we're so attuned to it, and to
Mm,
it's this kind of normal symbols of it, that from a cultural standpoint, that many of the deeper things are veiled, and even it leads to some actually false understandings of certain things that
yeah.
we associate with Christianity and we think are true of Christianity, but is
Mm.
actually not true of Christianity in any historical sense. So
Oh, that's right. I mean, so many of us have caricatures of Christianity, which is something I mentioned a few times in my book. It was actually Lewis's review of The Lord of the Rings where this quote is pulled from,
hmm,
where he talks about, how in a myth we can dip bread and gold and apple into myth and it can become re-enchanted. And as
yeah,
you know, probably in on fairy stories, Tolkien speaks at length in the fantasy section, I think, of the essay about enchantment being the appropriate word for what a fairy story does.
absolutely.
And I talk about it in the book. And so it's just very apropos that it comes from Lewis's own applause of the Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, those two is of course we've talked about on this podcast have had such a fruitful friendship, a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful and fruitful friendship. Despite the certain ways in which they had various fallings out over the years and later
Yeah.
on and that kind of thing.
That's right.
It really is beautiful to kind of see them as a model of true friendship, and what that can produce in the lives of two people, what a friendship like that can produce in the lives of two people. So
I agree.
I love that you incorporate Lewis a lot into this work as well.
He was crucial to
Absolutely.
understanding, yeah, his understanding of symbolism or sacramentalism, the imagination, myth. I mean, he wrote much more extensively about it than Tolkien did, for obvious reasons. Tolkien was busy with something. I can't remember exactly what book it was called. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, well,
But
and just there, it's almost like you sometimes think about the ideas that you might have as an individual.
mm,
It's evident from this book that that you're a very thoughtful person, and sometimes you
thank
can
you.
feel like you're stuck inside your head with all these things, insights that you're seeing in certain places, and you're like, man, I really wish I had somebody to talk about these things with
Yes.
on a regular basis. And it's
Yes.
clear that for a long period of their lives together, they were those individuals for each other. They
Quite agree.
see this like kindred spirit in one and the other, and they're able to kind of maybe take some of their ideas that would sound, they think, oh, this must be crazy to somebody else, but like I can mention this to Lewis, he'll
Yeah.
you know
He'll
he'll
understand.
understand what I'm talking about, or he'll tell me
Mm,
if I'm way off base, right?
exactly.
Lewis with Tolkien, is like, you're doing all these things that I've always wanted to see a writer do, or something.
Yeah. That's right.
So
Yep. Well
uh,
said.
in the introduction, you discuss the sensation of Lord of the Rings, that it feels more real than our everyday reality. And this
Mm,
is a startling idea, and one I definitely agree with. So
mhm.
tell us more about what you mean here and what you attribute this to.
Yeah, so I would attribute this to, and there's a rabbit hole we could fall down here, so I'll try not to, but I would trace this back down to the bottom line of the understanding that fairy stories are sacramental, or and Lewis used these two terms interchangeably, sacramentalism, symbolism. versus allegory. I would say that they're sacramental stories, that fairy stories are naturally sacramental, and basically sacramentalism or symbolism, I'll refer to it as sacramentalism from now on, is where the archetype can be seen, and the archetype being Christ in our tradition, the person of Jesus Christ, being seen and discerned in the lower, the higher and participating in the lower, not represented in the lower. That's allegory, roughly stated, or one understanding of allegory, but that we can get glimpses of the archetype in the lower things. And so I think that's what I'm trying to say in my book, is that, and for me personally, this was the wording that eventually I arrived at that helped me make sense, as I said earlier, of my understanding of why this story was haunting me so. And I'm not the first person to whom this has been a phenomenon. So, and this idea of it being more real, also I owe a great debt to Peter Kreeft for his insights on the philosophy of Tolkien book, which is quoted extensively, where he talks about Plato's influence and types and archetypes. And so all of that comes into play. And from a biblical point of view, as Kreeft really well knows, as a Catholic himself, that, typology from a biblical standpoint is exactly that, is where we see the archetype in the types, or to use Lewis's phraseology, he would say, see the archetype in the ectypes, but that basically is the same thing, the thing that foreshadows the archetype. And so we get these glimpses of how reality ought to look and how it ought to be. And of course, now one objection might be, and I didn't address this, and it was raised by a friend, Lord of the Rings Middle Earth, I should say, is not a perfect place. It's not heaven on earth yet, but it represents a wider understanding of reality, even one that we live in, where things that are not normally possible, or enchanted things, Tolkien talks about it on fairy stories, that fairy stories contain mountains and trees and the sun and the moon, but also ogres and fairies themselves and dragons and men when they're enchanted. So, we get a sense of that. And so I don't mean to imply that this is the new creation yet, but that we're getting glimpses. And of course, throughout my book, I later talk about in chapter 2, that I think there's a very much an already not yet sensation going on in the book, where we're getting this more capacious view of reality, I think, in Middle Earth. And it helps us to see reality in a more richer light. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. I mean, I would, the sense of already, but not yet, resonates with me deeply. I mean, I get the sense that there is that there's a deep eschatological sense, to all of Tolkien's works. In fact, I think it's one of those things that's like not been super deeply explored, and just in terms of like what he was trying to say. I know you do some of that in this work.
I do. Yes, I do.
And then we're gonna get to a little bit of that here in a few minutes.
Yep.
But yeah, it's really what's the right word for it? I mean, it's this thing that you just sense, that it's like you grasp this spiritual sense when you're reading these things, and it's almost like it's hard to nail down exactly. It's almost like when when Christian theologians attempt to define the sacraments and exactly what they are. It's like we can kind of have this like very, we can say what they are and what they aren't, and that's a lot of the discussion of where we end up saying. But at the end of the day, it's like you just have to dive in, right? And you might not even know this side of heaven during this life exactly what those things are doing to you, but they are transforming you. And it's that same kind of every once in a while you might get a glimpse, you might have a little sort of God moment or something like that, that clues you into what's going on. But yeah, it's like these things are just are veiled.
Well, and I think that's well said, John. And it was, I think, Charlie Starr in his book, Fawn's Bookshelf, where he explores C.S. Lewis's theology, or philosophy, if you like, of myth, among other things. And I don't know if he's quoting Lewis when he says this, but I may be off. He says it's like catching a glimpse of the heavenly landscape. And I think that, again, it may not, for the really intellectual listener, it might not spell it out. When you mentioned earlier, we don't know exactly what's doing it to us, but I think that's what it is when we're reading Tolkien, is that we catch these glimpses of, yeah, I always thought that that's how forests should really feel when I walk into them, or that's how friendship should be, or like for me, it was life should feel more urgent. And I'll just be blunt. I kind of hint at this in the book. I want a king to serve.
Yeah.
I want a mission to go on. Sometimes, and I laugh, kind of talk to myself in the car. I'm like, this is it. I'm going to Target on a toilet paper run. I'm like, yes, this is epic. We want some other battle to fight. We want some summons, all of a sudden to come out of nowhere, that we're wanted on some big quest, and we get that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I wanted to try to put my finger on. So I think a lot of people will get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
You were talking, I had just had like a million thoughts, and I feel like all of them like escaped my brain as I'm like trying to hold on to them, trying to grasp onto them.
I hear you.
But I will say, speaking of like places, like you read about these places in Lord of the Rings, and you're like, it's like, that's the way a forest should be, or that's the way mountains should be, or, something like that. And I kept on thinking of Liz Lemon from 30 Rock, and her saying, I want to go to there. Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it feels for me. It's just this, I want to go to all these places. Sometimes I will say, I don't know if you ever had a chance to play the Lord of the Rings online game.
I did.
But I've played it a little bit. I'm not a huge gamer, but I've played it some on the recommendation of some of our listeners. And every once in a while, when I have a half an hour that I can just somehow squeeze out, I'll just dive in, and it's highly enjoyable. It's so
it is.
It kind of gives you that sense, which is not something, of course, that Tolkien probably would have even been able to visualize in his day.
True.
Of course, it's somebody's rendering, so you can't get too wrapped up in it. But
of course.
But yeah, I do love this idea of just like sensing there's something like about this, this alternate reality, but it happens to be like a prehistory of our own reality.
Yeah.
And like just wanting to step into that, and and just the verisimilitude of it all, like feeling like every rock you pass by on this journey, you could look under, and there's a story about under there. And and also that rock is there for a reason, right? And there is some grand design to it all. So
well said. Yeah, I'm with you.
So later in the introduction, you take issue with those Christians who criticize the presence and influence of non-Christian mythological elements in Tolkien stories. So we did an episode a while back on like, is Lord of the Rings pagan? Because, and there's a lot of issues to talk about with that one question. But what is it you want to say to critics, maybe these Christians who criticize Tolkien's works for his incorporation of non-Christian mythological elements, and those sorts of things?
That's a great question, John. Two things. I think there's a critic in the Christian camp, and I think also, just to be personal, one of the peer reviews and with my first publisher, peer reviewers of my first publisher wrote that because there are non-Christian cultural and mythological religious elements in the story, therefore it isn't Christian. So you have that critic too. So you have the concerned Christian critic, and then you have, well, it can't be Christian, so maybe this is the secular reader, I don't know. But I would say to the first camp, to the Christian reader, that we ought not to be ashamed of the mythical radiance that rests upon our theology. And I'm quoting C.S. Lewis again in his essay, Myth Became Fact. And of course, Tolkien doesn't write as much about this, but you get this sense that in his letters here and there, and on fairy stories, I'm trying to think of some other places he might have alluded to this same notion, but certainly just by reading his stories, you can tell that he was at home with seeing a connection between the true myth, the Christian worldview, and non-Christian myths. And so I would say also not to be concerned, because these insights, these fragments that we perceive in other traditions, were put there, if we believe what the Bible says is true about man and woman, that we were created with a sense of God, and we're reaching out to him, and because he's reached out to us first. And these good dreams, as Lewis called them, again, are there because we're trying to find who put the dreams in our head to begin with. We're reaching out, and that it doesn't mean that they're identical, that these influences, these insights and other traditions are the same as what we see in Christianity, but they're dim dreams and premonitions, again, as Lewis said, not the real thing itself. And I think it just, I don't see the problem. I don't know why so many Christians are so resistant to this. I think maybe the influence of some of the things that Martin Luther in the 16th century said about, with his debate with Erasmus, I think it was, everything outside of the biblical tradition is outside of the light, and it should be confined to the devil and to darkness. And I don't know. I can't put my finger on it why there's such a concern. It's like we need Christianity to be purged of all of these non-Christian elements. And I wonder if that's not for people more so than we think we're doing this for God. So I think that's one thing I would say to that camp. And to the secular camp, I would say that it makes it more Christian that there are non-Christian elements there. And again, for the same reason that we believe God created man in his image, and that we are myth makers. We're reaching out, we're telling stories because God is a storyteller first, and that he wants us to find him and make sense of him and grope our way towards finding out that he is the source. And in order to do that, he can't just talk to one group of people. Now, he does so supremely through Israel, yes, but not supremely, not only. And do not all the other people of the world matter? I would say, of course they do. So God sent them good dreams to put them on a search to find the one true God. And that's what I would say, is that it's the argument against it being Christian turns out to backfire. Yeah. So
yeah, good stuff. And of course, this was something, of course, that both Tolkien was kind of a near and dear to both Tolkien and Lewis's hearts. I was struck as a young reader when I first read Out of the Silent Planet, and and here's these like gods of these other planets, but it's like they're good gods, like they're good angelic beings, like who are like they still serve like the one true, the ultimate God, right? Within this within this story. And I was like, that was mind blowing for me, because you grow up, and especially if you grow up in an understanding that can be maybe a little bit not just kind of fundamentalist. You're taught to read these like commandments, and you're like, well, you should have no other idols before me. And it's like, well, and so you're just like, well, any mention of other gods has to ultimately be like, just completely anathema. And but that doesn't really deal directly with the question of, okay, where did these things come from, right?
Exactly.
Where did those things and that doesn't make you a pluralist or or anything if you ask that question, right?
I don't think so.
And so yeah, good stuff for sure.
Thank you. There's a lot there.
Definitely there's a lot in that topic that we could probably dive into a lot more, perhaps another rabbit hole.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Yeah. So what does it mean? We brought up this word earlier. What does it mean that Lord of the Rings is a parabolic novel? I see that word and I think of a U-shaped graph from geometry. So what does it mean that Lord of the Rings is a parabolic novel?
I won't be able to follow you on the math, I'm ashamed to say, because I'm not a math guy. I should know more than I do. But anyway, just poking fun at myself here. Yeah, when I said parabolic, I meant, and I actually was quoting Sally McFague's book, Speaking in Parables. She's written a book several decades ago that actually mentions Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as an example of a parabolic novel. So just describing the nature of how truth is communicated in the book, because she, like many others, sees allegory as a problem in that it's very transparent to the way that it is seeking to communicate the reality it's pointing to. And of course, it seemed very clear to her, like many others, that this is not what Tolkien wanted. He didn't want to be transparent to it. As I dug deeper into this, I realized a great deal has been written. And in my interview with Michael Heiser on his podcast, he mentioned this. He suspects that many Tolkien authors don't have a background in the humanities or even in just biblical studies in particular. And so they might be missing this, but he agrees there's a lot of literature on distinguishing, the finer subtleties between allegory as a composition versus allegory as a mode, and then those terms and understandings over and against metaphor, and the fact that there are many different definitions of metaphor, and most people think all of these words mean the same thing. And if you throw parable in there, that's another word that means the same thing. and it's not. And so what I discovered is that this is a very particular way of saying Tolkien is reflected truth in a way that's very suggestive, very implicit, very respectful of his audience, that he's not trying to force it. He's not trying to make a sermon. He's trying to, in fact, in the words, and this is what really did it for me, his friend, Father Robert Murray, who he confided in and wrote letters to, later wrote an essay, which was actually a sermon that he gave in 1992 for the Tolkien centenary, called Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And to my surprise, I've just talked with some recently too, many Tolkien scholars haven't even heard of this essay. And
yeah, I think I may have heard about it from
important.
you a couple of months ago. But it's definitely one that I want to go back and read, because Murray, Murray's name does come up so often in the letters.
Yes,
sure.
yes.
So, and
And
a lot of those letters are very interesting letters. So
they are. And you quoted one earlier, letter 142, I think it was, and letter 156, I think, is another, about being a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. That was a letter to Murray. So Murray, I mean, is quite pointed about this, Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And in fact, in that essay, which you can find for those of you that are interested in Joseph Pierce's collection, Tolkien: A Celebration. It's a little book of collected essays. Murray says, and I'm loosely quoting him, he says, as opposed to allegory, in symbolism, i.e. sacramentalism, we find the natural potency in everyday things. We find something higher, we get a glimpse of something higher. And of course, this is kind of the language Tolkien uses in On Fairy Stories too, and elsewhere. And, it's taking this and putting it in a new context gives us a metaphor, a transference over, and shows us something new about something that we might have thought we knew well already. And this got me on all sorts of journeys, and I've got so much I can speak to this, but I just want to put, so I think there Murray, just to finish my point, was describing sacramentalism. He was relating it to what parables do and what fairy stories do. So he made the connection first. I just kind of built on it. So I want to say, no less a figure than Murray himself had already made this point long before I wrote anything. And really, to my understanding, and I searched high and low, and middle-ish, as one of my kids' books says, for any other scholar that wrote something like Murray, and I couldn't find it. I couldn't find anything about it. So I think this is a territory that we need to be, looking into more. Anyway, I'll stop there for now, but I have some other things that I want to say about it, especially because I know that there are concerns about these terms that many listeners to your podcast will have. And I find myself almost cutting myself off when I'm talking to people, and they almost lose interest when I start to tell them the thesis of my book, because they've already assumed, words like allegory, parable, metaphor can't be, any other way of saying the same thing. And to try to relate it to fairy story, especially allegory, is anathema. But that's not true. Tolkien, as Joseph Pierce points out, does in letter 186 say that Lord of the Rings is an allegory, just not of atomic power. He admits it's an allegory. In letter 181, he calls it a fairy story. Murray relates fairy story as a type of allegory. And so therefore, I think Tolkien does. And it seems that is the conclusion we should go in, or the direction we should go in, that Lord of the Rings is a type of allegory, but not the kind that he cordially disliked, and what he wrote about in letter 131, the conscious and intentional allegory. And so there is a spectrum, Joseph Pierce says, of allegories, and most people are not familiar with this. And I'll stop there, but see how complex it can get pretty quick.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No, you've made the case for sure. And, when you ultimately, when you put it back to Tolkien's own words on these topics, right? And so, and I would just encourage everybody, right? I mean, Michael wrote a book about these things, so you need to pick up his book so that you can read more in depth on these topics. You've gone quite into depth on several of these issues. In fact, the first chapter is called "The Lord of the Rings is Parable," so you really set out to make the case. And it's not like you haven't read up on what Tolkien said about allegory, and that you're trying to put forward this this other thing.
And thank you.
And so we need to it's good also, if we're interested in these topics, to distinguish between different ideas like different literary types like parables and allegories and metaphors. Just a quick side note. So I looked up what because I was interested in the connection between a parable and the idea of a parabola, right? And from math, right?
Yeah.
Which, if everybody remembers from parabola, it's that U-shaped graph, right? Represented by y equals x squared.
Hmm.
And so apparently the word, if you break it down, it comes from Greek, and it's like para, which means like side by side, right?
Hmm.
And bola, which means to throw, right?
Hmm.
So it means
Hmm.
to like throw something side by side, which is really interesting to think about. Then a parable, which is like, you think of the stories of Christ as parables, and he's telling this story about whatever, about let's just say a parable of the prodigal son, right? And
Hmm.
it's the son who goes off to a distant land, and then he squanders all of his inheritance and comes back. But Jesus is telling that story, but he's telling another story at the same time, right? And
Exactly.
that's what every parable is, right?
Yes. Yes.
That's what every parable is. And so in a way, it's like, how can any literary work
Right.
not be parabolic, right?
Well,
It's almost
and
like like if you're telling a story
yeah.
that's a fictional story, it's going
Hmm.
to be parabolic, right?
Can I speak to that for a second? Because
Go
this
ahead.
is a
Yeah.
good. I'll keep it really simple. I promise. So just because as you said, and thank you for saying it, because I present the argument in chapter 1 of the book primarily. Here's the bottom line that I came to, and if you listeners will be kind enough to read the book to see the argument and give it a chance, then that would be great. But there's a spectrum of allegories. We could say that there's a spectrum of parables, and many scholars make the case that this is two ways of saying the same thing, because you'll see the common denominator in both is allegorical language. But I went with a spectrum of allegory because Tolkien seemed to, and because Tolkien scholars like Joseph Pearce and others have gone in that direction, including Robert Murray. So that's why I settled on that. And a case that you could swap them out could be made by reading any book by any biblical scholar like Klein Snodgrass on parables. But anyway, you have a spectrum. You have on one end the very conscious and intentional allegory, i.e., the forward to the second edition of Lord of the Rings and letter 131 to Milton Waldman. That's the kind he did not dislike. Now, why did he dislike it? Because according to scholars like Gisela Kreglinger, who says, because of the presence of the superabundance of allegorical language. Now, what's that?
Mm.
Allegorical language, allegory can be a composition or a mode of languaging. Allegorical mode is very, it's indirect language, but it's very directly indirect. It's not going to take very long for you to lift the veil and say, aha, here it is. This is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's actually quite shallow. Okay.
Mm.
And when you have, as Tolkien says in his introduction to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl and Sir Ofeo, I think he says, just because you have allegorical language in a story doesn't mean that the whole thing is an allegory. So this is kind of inevitable. Okay. And Tolkien admits this. So you have on this one end, you have a very obvious kind of allegory
Mm-hmm.
that is just overwhelmingly so, as in Sir Gawain, where he talks about the whole story kind of amounts to this equals that. Obviously, everybody knows he didn't like that. On the other end, you might say, just to keep this simple, is the fairy story, which, as I've already kind of done some acrobatics to show very shortly in this podcast, that is analogous to the New Testament parable, that they basically function as sacramental stories. Well, this too has allegorical language, but it has more what we would say metaphorical language. That is language that is not this for that. It's more suggestive.
Mm-hmm.
Most people think of metaphor as this for that, but actually, as scholars have shown, metaphor is more this is suggestive of that. It's not exactly that. And this is the way that Tolkien wrote in hints and riddles. And he even says that to Murray in a letter. He says, I've kept everything, every allusion to the highest matter down to mere hints. He spells that out practically.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the art of the parable that Murray's referring to, that Jesus established. And I think Tolkien just tried to imitate his Lord in telling the story that way. And so I would see that, again, that's on the other end of the spectrum. It reflects truth in a very different way than the kind of story allegory that he dislikes. So that's the simplest way I can put it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a truly fascinating topic, because it speaks ultimately to what inspired Tolkien to write these stories that we all know and love. And and also what he saw himself as doing upon further reflection, right? Which is a very interesting topic to me. Like one, and I may have missed references, but I don't know. Did you happen to deal at all with Leaf by Niggle in
No,
this book?
I should have, but no, there was
Well,
already so much.
no, and that's not a criticism. I mean,
No, no.
you were very thorough in dealing with topics that reflected your main thesis for sure. And Tolkien has such a huge body of work; it's almost, I mean, it wouldn't really be possible to write one book on all of his works. But Leaf by Niggle has become a story that is like near and dear to my heart over the years as a Tolkien fan, and I just think it's like it's almost like the key to everything, to understanding what he was doing. And what's really cool about it is it was almost like it was a divinely inspired story, like that he just woke up one morning and like cranked this thing out, not even really knowing what he was writing about. And you read it and you're like, whoa, he's basically writing about his life, right? And this is before Lord of the Rings came out, when he's all anxious that Lord of the Rings might never come out, right? Might never get completed, which of course the Silmarillion, which was the other thing that was near and dear to his heart, never was released during his lifetime. So, you can kind of go that angle with it too. But anyway,
that's right.
So chapter 3, very provocative title. The Lord of the Rings is good news. I think most readers would surmise at this point that you mean more than just positive news, but instead have the gospel itself in mind. So, and we've kind of dwelt on this some, but tell us just a little more directly how you arrive at that equivalence.
Yeah, well, so I slowly build up to this conclusion by first dealing with all the literary jargon and the multivalent definitions of such and such term in chapter 1. Chapter 2, I make the case, once we understand what a parable is as a sacramental story that does contain allegorical language, inevitably, but also, and I would say more predominantly so, contains more metaphorical, therefore suggestive language, which leaves lots of rereadings open to possibility for readers. And then in chapter 3, with that understanding, I say, okay, well, parables, Jesus used these types of stories that we've established. So there's a sequence here, right? To communicate what he was there to do and who he was, which are kind of bound up together, right? And then I looked at what biblical scholars from the Catholic Brant Petra, who I really enjoy,
he's one of my favorite, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, and for good reason. His book on Mary is a revelation, but that's another story, maybe another podcast. To Protestants like Anglican N.T. Wright, who I know everybody loves to put pins in and dissect. So, and I obviously drew on Wright because he was formative in my story, which I tell in the preface. So go back and read that. So what I basically make this case is that the title of the Red Book, The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King, is a perfect, tight summary of what Christian worldview is all about. And I think it's what Frodo basically says, oh, look, there are all these titles that Bilbo had, and this is the one that makes the most sense. So we're going to go with this one. Right. This is the conceit, of course, for the book within the book, as we know about the Red Book of Westmarch. So I think it's a perfect way to start the chapter. And basically what I end up meaning by this is that it's an already and not yet story. And you have to go back to chapter 2 to find out more about what that entails. Good news is what Christianity is. And what Christianity is a story about something that has happened, but is still happening. And this gets into theology of the new creation, which is called inaugurated eschatology in the business. There's one name for it, which obviously figures prominently into the works of Brant Petra, who studied with Amy Jo Levine and others who talk about this, and N.T. Wright, hence why they're quoted in the book. And basically we see in the return of Aragorn, and here's the most provocative bit, I think we're seeing the good news show up. And like in our own story, what we need to understand is that this doesn't solve all the world's problems. And I've seen Tolkien scholars say, well, we know the Lord of the Rings isn't a fully Christian novel because it has a sad ending. And because, the incarnation hasn't come. I said, well, what if we've misunderstood the incarnation? And that's the case that many of these authors I've just mentioned say. And I said, well, it's a sad story precisely because it's so Christian, because the Christian story is sad. Not everything has been healed yet. Christ died. He really died. He really rose. He really lives. But and I don't know if "but" is the right word, but you know what I'm getting at.
Oh, sure.
And he is still reigning, as 1 Corinthians 15. We know Paul says, until all enemies are put under his feet, and the last enemy to be defeated is death. And so this is the not yet portion. Tolkien says this at the end of On Fairy Stories. A Christian has to still work, suffer, and die, but he knows that his work and suffering is for a purpose. It isn't for nothing. And I saw that in the book, and I think that again was Mike trying to make sense of why did this story affect me so? Because I think it's realistic, and realistic to me is synonymous with how Christ sees the world. And I see that on display here. I mean, it's very clear that I'm edified by knowing there's still work to be done. That goes back to what I was saying earlier about wanting to be called on a mission. And since I've felt that, I now realize I am called to do more dramatic things than just go to Target, even though that can be fun and dramatic too. I do realize as a Christian now, I am called into a great mission to obey a king, to fall at his feet and say, as Tim Keller has said in one of his books, command me, tell me what you want me to do. And I realize I'm in that story, and that's why it affected me so. And so I saw that already not yet presence in the narrative, and I think it's very clearly, but not exclusively, in the figure of Aragorn. And I just focused on Aragorn because, first of all, space doesn't permit me to get into Gandalf and Frodo, who represent together with Aragorn the three offices of Christ, which is something I know you well know. And I try to
tell our listeners real quick what those three offices are, because I may know, but many of them might not.
Of course, yes. So John, it's the king is Aragorn, and this is, I think, from the letter to Hebrews in the New Testament, among other places. You have the prophet, which is represented, and these three offices refer to Christ, but in the Lord of the Rings, it would be Aragorn as king, Gandalf as prophet, and I would see Frodo as the high priest. Who importantly, and this gets into another rabbit hole, but Frodo in a sense fails, a very, very real failure. And maybe in a way, I don't know, Tolkien was trying to say the world viewed Christ's crucifixion as a failure. I don't want to read into that too much, but it of course is the eucatastrophe comes into play here. It is the world's greatest failure if it is that. We know that it was the greatest success. So anyway, yeah, those are the three offices, and I just didn't have time or space to explore them. But I want my listeners and readers to know I'm fully aware of the literature on the subject and the theology. It's just that, to me, Aragorn really makes it pop, I think. It just very dramatically. Tolkien, this is another thing, if you read my book, you'll see that I do, has these transfiguration moments I found not a lot of people have written about. And those stuck with me, especially when he's passing through the Argonath and the Fellowship towards the end of the book. And the hobbits are looking at him, and the weather-worn rangers kind of stripped away as a king returning to his country out of exile. I'm thinking, there it is right there.
Yeah.
That to me is the good news, and it just sticks with you.
Yeah.
And with Aragorn, he puts in a lot of effort. So anyway.
I kept on thinking of Sam's line when he wakes up, right?
Yeah.
He wakes up and sees Gandalf. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Right.
I love that line.
My gosh, I just I say all the time on the podcast, like I get goosebumps, and then start like tearing up whenever I think of those words. Right.
Me too. Me too.
It's like, what an incredible moment. And and I think I think Sam's words there actually are like a little nugget of what you were saying, right? That this victory has been had, and Sam knows that not everything sad has come untrue, but is everything sad going to come untrue? Like, oh my gosh, if Gandalf can come back to life, and if we can take the ring to Mordor, then maybe everything sad is going to come untrue.
Yeah.
Right. In the end. Right. Yeah. And it's like, how can something come untrue? Once it's happened, how can it come untrue? Yes. And so even that word in its like nonsensical nature is eschatological, because it's like, well, eye has not seen, ear has not heard. Right. Like,
that's right.
And so, I kept on thinking of that line.
And of course, I quoted at some point, and I'm right there with you. It moves me deeply every time I hear it and read it. But I think a little later on too, Gandalf says a great shadow has departed, not the great shadow, because he understood. And as Tolkien started, and I talk about this, the unfinished sequel to The Lord of the Rings, The New Shadow, which I talk about in chapter 3, this is the point Tolkien was trying to make. There's still work to be done. There's still evil in the world. Yeah. Sauron is but just one manifestation. Melkor, Morgoth was the first. There will be another. And we already see that in the new Shadow. That was of course, he abandoned it after staying up till 2 a.m., struggling with it and saying, oh, to heck with this. I think I've written enough. Oh, please. I wish he had finished it.
I know. That's one of those things, sad things that could come untrue there, Tolkien. Just
yeah.
So, but I guess we're not going to get that.
No,
But
anyway, yeah.
Well, it's interesting that he kind of, I think, I won't have his exact words, but I feel like one of the reasons he abandoned it was he started writing and he's like, this is just going to be too depressing. like after such a huge victory,
yeah,
at the end of Lord of the Rings, it's like,
there's
it's just going to be going down for a long time. Kind of like how the Silmarillion seems, so dark for so much of it, right? Until the very end. And even then it's like, it doesn't really get, like, the end of the Lord of the Rings is kind of the big happy moment of the entire 3 ages. There's really not like another time other than
right.
You could argue that the downfall of Morgoth at the end of the Silmarillion is, but even then it's like there's so much damage done by the downfall of Morgoth that that the world is so like changed through that process that it's like, whew, that took a lot.
It's a gut punch for sure. I agree.
So in chapter 4, you turn the spotlight on Thorin, the king beneath the mountain. You claim that Thorin prefigures Aragorn in the same way that King David of Israel prefigured Jesus. So I found that really interesting. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so my inspiration for doing this once again was the words of Tolkien himself in several letters, but one in particular. I don't have it. I've quoted several in the episode, but I think it was like 163. Don't quote me on this, but one of the letters he writes that part of the appeal of the Lord of the Rings are due to the glimpses into the vast history, into the background, right? As you said earlier, you turn over a rock, there's a story about that rock. There's something there that's there for a reason. I think of the rocks on the way to Rivendell and all that. Anyway, there's a story literally behind everything. He wove so much into the story, and you get, I think one scholar tallied, there's so many X number of references to just one part of the Silmarillion alone in the Lord of the Rings. And so there's this abundance of quotations. And so part of my inspiration came from this idea that it seemed that Tolkien, especially later when he wrote the debate of Finrod and Andreth, was meditating on his work, reflecting on it, looking back on it, and saying how Christological it ended up being. I think Christopher Tolkien agreed when we get to talking about the debate. And so this whole idea of looking back, and then I found this obscure book, which shouldn't be obscure because it's quite good, by Christopher Scarf, who I give credit to in the book for helping me understand this, that looking back was a very big thing for Tolkien, and he wanted his readers to do this. And his title of this book, by the way, is really, really long, but it's in my bibliography. It's by Christopher Scarf, like the one you wear around your neck, and it's about the Inklings anyway. And so that's what kind of set me off. So I started with Tolkien, and then I found, somebody talked about this, and quite as you put it, Thorin in many ways, I think, prefigures, and this using the framework of typology, which I lay out in the introduction of the book. In the book overview, I talk about my approach to the way the book is written, where we look, starting at the furthest point, looking all the way back to the beginning, was inspired in the reasons that I just went over. And so in this natural way of doing things, after we finish The Lord of the Rings, I go back to The Hobbit, and we look at the story of Thorin. And I even saw and even allude to Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies, which we won't get into at this moment, but where Gandalf says when Thorin is charging, that they're rallying to their king. And I think Jackson was even trying to allude to this idea that Thorin is just the beginning of a real rally that's going to happen around the real king. And so I even see that reflected in some of the films. But of course, in the books, primarily, I see all of the prophecies and the songs about Thorin and his return are quite left unfulfilled and are left to others to fulfill them, because Thorin, of course, tragically dies. I see him in a very much a sense of an Old Testament sort of prefigural way, which doesn't mean that it's this for that at all, because their stories are very different. And again, Tolkien said that he was reminded of the Jews when he was writing about the dwarves. And for those of you that are not aware, that is in a letter to Naomi Mitchison, I think. in one of the letters.
And that does not, some people have tried to construe that as being somehow like anti-Semitic, which is just crazy because Tolkien, as I love to remind people when they want to say that Tolkien, for some reason, there's people out there that always want to associate Tolkien with anti-Semitism and racism and even Nazism, and you're just like, actually, Tolkien was taking on the Nazis directly before it was cool, right?
That's right.
He hated the Nazis. He despised anti-Semitism. So the whole reason he made that connection is because he loved the dwarves and he admired the Jewish people.
Exactly. Right? That's exactly right.
Mind-blowing to me.
It is mind-blowing. And of course, in my book, I mentioned that the way of looking at scripture typologically or typologically, tomato, is this idea that when we're looking in the Old Testament text, we're not just looking at it to, go through it and say, okay, we don't need this. Let's get to the Jesus bit. That's the proof texting predictive way of reading scripture. The prefigural typological way of reading scripture is to look at the Old Testament to see what it's worth on its own, to extract the hermeneutical meaning just for that time period, and to see how Jesus is foreshadowed, but only in light of, we can only see that in light of the resurrected Son of God anyway. And so it's a very different way of approaching scripture. And that's the way I try to approach Tolkien's books, because I do see them as Christian. And I think that's a very careful, respectful way to also approach the Jewish core of our faith, which I try to make a big fuss over as well in the book. So anyway, that's chapter 4.
Great stuff. And just understanding, it just makes me think of, just as Thorin, we see him and we're like, there's very many admirable things about him. But he is a very flawed individual, right? Just as David was a very flawed individual, right? He was this great king of Israel. He is the typological, like, kind of king of Israel. But he was also an extremely flawed individual.
Absolutely.
And so you get to Aragorn, and Aragorn is just this, like, I mean, he's not perfect, but he's this shining example. He's like, that's what kind of an earthly king should be, right? That's how an earthly king should come across. Just as Christ ends up being like the perfected version of King David, right?
Exactly right.
So
yep.
Yeah, right. I love that. I love that connection. Not one I'd ever thought of before. So
well, thank you. Well, and I think you'll find a lot there to hopefully write about for yourself, because I've enjoyed your books, especially on Beren and Luthien. So thank you for that. Very much so. In fact, just recently reread it. So there was a point I was going to make, though. There, I even go into Hebrew poetry, Old Testament poetry, and the likeness that I see in Tolkien's poetry about Thorin and about Aragorn, because I think that's an important thing too, is that we know that Tolkien was a linguist and words mattered to him, and his poetry is the best, I think. So and some of the best is about Thorin and Aragorn. So yeah.
Fantastic. In chapter 5, you've mentioned this already. You deal with the relatively obscure text, The Debate of Finrod and Andreth. And that's a chapter from the 10th volume of the History of Middle-earth series, which honestly, if you did percentages, it's like people who have read The Hobbit, and then it's like, maybe, and then you get people who have read Lord of the Rings, and that's most of the, most people have read those two. If you're at all interested in Tolkien, you've read at least The Hobbit and probably Lord of the Rings. And then the Silmarillion is like probably less than half of the people who have read those, probably way less than half. And then I can only imagine the History of Middle-earth series. Now, that's still a lot of people in the grand scheme of things, but percentages wise, it's hard to get all the way to the History of Middle-earth Volume 10. I know, because we're doing a series on the history of Middle-earth right now, just kind of a survey, and it's like, whoa, it's like this
huge.
Some of this, it's huge. Some of this just makes your eyes glaze over. Some of this is really fascinating, but it's like you're trying to find the nuggets in all of this. I've heard, so I will admit, I have not read the entirety. I've read a good part of it, but I've not read the entirety of The Debate of Finrod and Andreth. But it's one that I've had other people mention to me over the years as being like, y'all got to do an episode or a series of episodes on this one. But so anyway, that was a long aside to say, why did you choose to wrestle with this work in a book that otherwise focuses on elements from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, and obviously, I talk about the Ainulindale and some other aspects of the Silmarillion, not all of it by any means in chapter 5, but the debate is just particularly obscure. And it's because I read a great many books that started to quote from it. I remember, I think, Brad Berzer's book, J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth. Maybe that was the first book I said, oh, I really got to look into this. And he wrote something like, well, he was commenting on what Christopher Tolkien said about his father's work in the debate, and that got me interested. Where he said that Christopher said that he saw his father's work here as almost an extension of Christian theology. That is, he was trying to find how his work was truly Christological and how it fit into his legendarium, and I thought that was very fascinating. But then also how Berzer describes it as almost like a Job-like dialogue, which isn't. I mean, there's evil is brought up. I would say that it is very Job-like. Part of the debate is about Andreth, who's a woman who's struggling with mortality and death,
Meaning
and that
she's a of the race of men, right? So
of
she's
the
not
race of men, exactly. Yes,
Mhm.
sorry. And that she, I think, was in love with Finrod's brother, if I'm not mistaken. There might have been some unrequited love there. I'm not familiar with all the details, to be perfectly honest, either. I was really interested in the incarnational aspects of the text in particular, not even really the problem of evil. So some of you out there may know this text even better. But what I think, aside from about death and the problem of evil, it is supremely about, I think, the incarnation. And that's what Berzer kind of tipped me off to, that he said that it was, I think, the most incarnational of Tolkien's writings. And I thought, wow, I really have to give that a read. Kind of like Murray's essay, it was like, I've mentioned this to a lot of people and they're like, wow, okay, I'll read it. So, I wanted to look at what I saw was a different way of looking at the gospel, one in which I think we spend so much attention to, spend so much time and pay so much attention to. The whole point of the gospels was that Jesus was divine, and we missed the forest through the trees. And so I kind of come to this challenging conclusion that I think the incarnation is present in a way that's very difficult to word, as you saw from reading my book, in the Lord of the Rings, not in the way that we would expect a actual incarnate Christ figure to show up and say, "Hi, I'm God." But that's not even how it happens in the Gospels.
Mhm.
And as many scholars have pointed that out, like Brant Petra. And
Yes.
so I make this case that Tolkien basically reflects the incarnation in a very Jewish way,
Mhm.
in parables and riddles. Okay, and um, combining this with the insights of Berzer, I've come to this conclusion that it seems like we could make a case that Aragorn, who is one of the names that he has, is Estel, meaning hope, one of two
Mhm.
words for hope, is the long hoped for incarnation of Iluvatar, if we understand the incarnation as God arriving as king, that
Mhm.
the Valar are enthroned, that in fact Berzer makes this case that the king was Manwë's representative on Earth, and Manwë was, of course, the representative of Iluvatar. And so I put all these connections together, and I thought, this could make sense if we're looking at the incarnation as God becoming king rather than Jesus is divine, because
Mhm.
that point is kind of caught up in the first point. And N.T. Wright has written a lot about this. For those of you that are interested, his book "How God Became King" is the chief source
Mhm.
for those of you interested.
Mhm.
And so I see this connection. I think, okay, if we understand the incarnation as God is reigning in Middle Earth and not God perfected everything, the new creation has come, everything is happy and joyful, and we're living in our perfect bodies. Going back to what I said earlier, which we don't see, right? We don't see that at the end of the story, but I still see the incarnation. I see it present in Aragorn. And if you look at the text of the debate of Finrod and Andreth, Finrod, who is the brother, elvish brother of Galadriel,
Mhm.
is talking to Andreth about how he thinks that it will be through men, not elves, that the coming of Iluvatar will occur, and that the men are not mankind is not the followers that the elves saw them as, and that they're really the heirs of all. And he sees and describes the incarnation as a painter entering his picture, as an author entering his book, but remaining the author without, and all these kinds of very parabolic ways of stating the incarnation, in my opinion.
Wow.
So that's what the
Great.
chapter is about. It's a
Yeah.
doozy.
Fascinating.
Mm.
It made me think of how so often in the Old Testament um, God, the God of Israel, is basically like saying to the people, like, I'm your king. I want to be your king. And they're like, well, no, we want a king like all the other nations. And it's like, oh, well, if you want a king like all the other nations, I guess I can give you one of those, but you're not gonna like
Taxes.
it, right?
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
so, and then ultimately, the answer to that is that like he gives them his own son as king, right?
That's
So
right.
yeah, that's uh, great insight. I will also say that uh, once again on Brant Petrie, his book The Case for Jesus
Hmm.
um, is for those who are interested in like this, the like kind of interested in questions of like the historicity of the gospels and that kind of thing, and what what's going on there. If you're not particularly well versed, it's a great starting point on that topic for
So
understanding
good.
the various issues. And it's also fascinating because, like you were saying, he makes the case that Jesus wasn't going to come right out and say, here I am, I'm God, everybody, right?
Yeah.
um,
Hey, how's it going? Yeah.
and I don't know. I find that instead he does it in a very Jewish way, and he alludes to all these different prophecies from the Old Testament and speaking of himself. But I remember I actually used that book with a high school class one time,
Mm.
and I just remember thinking to myself and talking to the kids and being like, "Isn't it so interesting that like God is shy? Like
Yeah,
he's
he loves to hide, doesn't he?
he likes to hide."
Yeah.
I've said this I think before on our podcast. Like maybe my favorite biblical verse
Mm.
is from the Old Testament, from Proverbs, and it's the glory of God is to conceal a matter. The um, what is it? The glory of God
Glory
is
of
to conceal a
Kings.
matter, and the glory of kings is to find it. Right? Is to
That's
seek it
it.
out. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
and I love that verse. It's like
It hits you.
that explains so much.
It does in that terse, succinct way that only a proverb can. Where,
Yeah.
like Tim Keller says, it's like a hard candy. You've got to really you don't bite down on it. You suck on it for a while and you get the insights. So, and that's the way that I think Tolkien represents. I should probably use a different word. Uh, Communicates, suggests, hints at, teases the incarnation is present. I think in that way he forces us to understand the incarnation in a different way. And this is the point that I want listeners to really get, is that Tolkien well knows that Jesus is divine. He's the second person of the Trinity. He's God's son. That's not the point he's trying to make. Remember, part of his audience is reaching people who already think they know what they know about the gospel. I know this. I know what the parable of the prodigal son is about. Don't tell me. Don't tell me. Okay. How do you reach people like that? Well, you don't do it by telling them a story they already know.
Right.
And that's what parables do. And that use of metaphorical language is, in fact, one scholar even put it this way, and this is what hit me when I wrote the book. Metaphor opens up and teaches you new things. Metaphorical language, allegorical language in a story reminds you and taps you on the shoulder of what you already know. It's good for people who just need kind of a refresher, maybe reaffirmation. You think of like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, or maybe even some of C.S. Lewis's writings, like the Chronicles of Narnia, although that's a whole complex, different story. And I would say they're not simplistic allegories like many people think, but maybe a little more
David
allegorical.
Bates would appreciate you for saying that.
I think he did on his podcast too. I want to be very careful because I don't want to
No,
get him
he always
hashtagging me.
whenever that topic comes up, he always I what is it? He always he's like, not allegory, but he uses another word,
He
another
does.
term, and I would have had it if I hadn't tried to
Supposal.
remember this. Yes, that's well. There is supposal, and there was another one
Yeah.
he uses as well. I remember
Uh,
supposal from your book, and I was like, yeah,
mhm.
that's a I like that.
It's a good word, isn't it?
It's a great word.
Yeah.
And but there,
What does
yeah,
he say?
maybe it was supposal, but I thought there was something else. So
I
I'm
think you're
sure
right.
David will chime in once he listens to this episode. So
Yeah, yeah, and that's just it. Is that it's not the Lord of the Rings. It is
right.
different, but I would say it's often way too criticized for being more overtly allegorical than it actually is. And Michael Ward has made that case in saying it's a very symbolic story. It's sacramental. It's just that people don't we're uninitiated with all these terms, so we don't know how to really understand the difference. But anyway,
Well,
coming
I
back,
think I,
there it
if
is.
I could
Yeah,
just say a quick thing,
I'm done. Yeah, yeah.
I think the reason people can be so like it's almost like dismissive of the Chronicles of Narnia is because it's pretty easy to see when somebody explains it to you how Aslan is Jesus, and
Yeah.
and the like the whole like kind of arc of the of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is like the gospel is the passion story arc, right?
Exactly.
And but that can also lead to that veil of familiarity, right, where you fail to see
Yes.
all the other cool stuff that's going on. Because if you have, and it's been a long time since I've taken like a close look and just trying to expand my mind around the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But I remember even listening to Prince Caspian and the Voyage of the Dawn Treader on a trip a few years ago, on a car trip a few years ago, just being like, man, there's so much to these stories. They're so good.
Oh.
Like, um,
We're on voyage right now with my son, and I know David's upset at me. I think we took the chronological route of reading the book, so he hashtag hereticted me, I think, one time. So I owe him an apology. But yeah, we started with The Magician's Nephew, but my son, he's loved the books. But yeah, they're so deep, they're so profound, and much more than I think people give them credit for being. So
absolutely. Well, Michael, this has been an outstanding conversation. There's so much more I feel like I wanted to dive into, and and for all of you listeners, like here's what I want to say to you about this book. There's been a lot of ink spilled over the years on the topic of Christianity and Lord of the Rings, right? And there's been a lot of back and forth on this topic. So for those of you who've maybe already read on this topic and be like, oh, I don't need to read another book on this topic, you're wrong. Okay. You need to go pick up Michael's book. It goes way, it acknowledges all of that scholarship, all of that writing that's come before. It's very well versed in all of that writing, and it goes even deeper and gains even greater insights. And just your writing on the whole question of what Tolkien's true feelings about allegory and parable and all these other topics alone is insightful and refreshing, and scratches beneath the surface of what we've all become accustomed to, right? Like good scholarship should look deeper into things that we all take to be true and say, have we just kind of adopted a cliche in these things and not actually understood what was really going on, right?
Wow.
And I think you do a good job of like unpacking a lot of these things and discovering a lot of these things. And
How
so
come you didn't endorse my book, John?
you
That was
didn't bring it to me up front.
I should have known you. That's a way to put it.
That's my endorsement for it.
I can't thank you enough. Wow.
Here. So I just want to encourage all of our listeners to go and pick up a copy of Michael's book. It's available on all the normal places. Paperback and ebook, correct?
Yep.
The audiobook, gonna get an audiobook at any point?
I need somebody to help me with the tech stuff. I want music. I don't know if that's possible. Something.
Well, maybe let's talk about it. Maybe let's talk about it. I've done a little bit of that. So
I would love to. Yeah.
So this has been just a delightful conversation, Michael.
Likewise.
Where can listeners find you on the interwebs?
Thank you, John, for that glowing endorsement. And I really appreciate you having me on. It really means a lot that you appreciated the work and you asked some really great questions. So again, thank you for your time. I have finally got an intelligible URL for my website. I bought the whole, new URL so it would make it easier for people to find. www.mythicmission.com. Mythic Mission, like myth as in a story. Mythic Mission is my and my wife's podcast. And like we've just recently had Dr. Holly Ordway on the show. We had an expert on Stoicism, kind of talk about Stoicism and Christianity with me recently. We've had a bunch of people on there. I have a website there where basically everything I've done, everybody I've spoken to, all the interviews, blah, 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 all that stuff is collected in one single place. So there you go, mythicmission.com.
Fantastic. Mythicmission.com. We'll make sure and link to it in the show notes. But everybody go check it out right now. Bookmark it and all those good things. All right. Well,
thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been a real pleasure. So that's all for this episode. Thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: Caitlin of Tea with Tolkien, Lise U, Andrew T, John R, Ms. Anonymous, Shannon S, Brian O, Emilio P, Zeke F, James A, James L, Chris L, Chuck F, Azia V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, Jonathan D, Eric S, Joey S, Eric B, Johanna T, Mike M, Durenair, Robert H, Paul D, Jacob S, and Julia, as well as those celebrating their patron anniversary in May. Ms. Anonymous, Joshua Y, Donna S, Rebecca R, James R, and Ty M. And thank you, Michael, for sitting through our listing of patrons.
I'm happy to do it.
Whenever we have a guest on, I'm always a little bit like, oh man, I got to make them sit through this right now. But
I'm glad you have so much support. That's wonderful. You deserve it.
I am too. Our patrons are awesome. So, and
They sound like it.
And so, Michael, thanks a lot. And
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will talk at you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay.